Remember walking into Coles or Woolies a few years back and spotting those weird little signs in the baby aisle? The ones that instituted a strict 2-tin limit per customer. You might also recall that the infant formula wasn't even on the shelf anymore. It was locked behind the service counter right next to the cigarettes, treated like a restricted substance. If you're a parent, you probably remember it more vividly. You likely recall arriving at your local supermarket to do the weekly shop, only to find the formula shelves stripped completely bare. The buyers emptying these stores, though, weren't other local parents. They were coordinated teams of personal shoppers moving systematically through the store in groups of up to 8, filling trolleys with every available tin. Once they cleared a location, they packed the boots of their cars and drove directly to the next supermarket to repeat the process. These shoppers operated under the name Daigou, which translates to buying on behalf of. The network became so aggressive and expansive that it eventually intersected with the Chinese Navy. When Chinese warships docked at Australian ports on goodwill visits, sailors were photographed flooding into local supermarkets to load up on baby formula to ship back home. All of this generated a massive windfall for an obscure dairy business called the A2 Milk Company. They ended up riding the Daigou pipeline to a multi-billion-dollar valuation on the ASX. Today, A2 Milk operates inside a massive contradiction. Their entire business relies on selling infant formula to Chinese families, but China is rapidly running out of babies. The national birth rate has halved in under a decade, hitting a historic low of just 7.9 million last year. Logically, a formula company operating in a shrinking demographic should be bleeding revenue, but instead, A2 Milk is posting record profits and aggressively expanding its market share. To understand how they're defying this demographic collapse and how a standard tin of milk powder triggered an international retail frenzy in the first place, we have to start with the original contamination panic. In the mid-2000s, China's dairy production surged, growing tenfold in a single decade, which collided with strict government price controls. Beijing capped the wholesale price of milk to curb national inflation right as the global cost of cattle feed spiked, meaning farmers couldn't increase their prices. Dairy farmers were forced to absorb the deficit, operating at a steep financial loss on every litre they supplied. To offset these severe financial losses, suppliers began diluting their vats with water to artificially inflate their yield. But every shipment of milk was tested for protein density, and the watered-down milk instantly failed these quality checks, resulting in the supply trucks being turned away. To beat these tests, suppliers turned to melamine. Melamine is an industrial chemical typically used to manufacture flame-retardant plastics. Melamine is highly toxic to humans. If ingested, it interacts with normal body chemistry to form tiny, insoluble crystals that aggregate into physical stones. In a newborn infant, this causes blockages in the kidneys and leads to severe, life-threatening complications. But the chemical possesses a specific trait that made it highly valuable to the fraudulent suppliers. It was loaded with nitrogen. The standard test utilized by the entire dairy industry to measure protein doesn't actually measure protein. It measures nitrogen levels and assumes that nitrogen is derived from protein. When suppliers added melamine to their watered-down milk, the nitrogen readings spiked, successfully bypassing the quality control tests at the processing plant. Salesmen began arriving at Chinese dairy farms with unmarked 25-kilo paper bags of what they branded as protein powder. The farm operators understood the true contents of the bag, but they also recognized the alternative was total bankruptcy. The chemical was tipped into the vats, and the contaminated milk was subsequently processed into cartons, yogurts, and infant formula. The biggest buyer of this cheap, melamine-spiked milk was a state-backed dairy giant called Sanlu Group. Sanlu was the undisputed market leader in domestic baby formula, and they held prestigious government awards and sold their product at roughly half the price of imported brands. This aggressive pricing made Sanlu the default choice for millions of working-class families. But by late 2007, those families started noticing severe medical issues in their children. The first complaints reached Sanlu in December 2007. parents were reporting kidney stones in their newborns. And kidney stones in infants are almost medically unheard of, yet Sanlu received a continuous stream of identical complaints. Sanlu didn't issue a public recall. They conducted internal tests and officially confirmed the melamine contamination in their own labs on August 1st, 2008. But rather than alerting the public or the central government in Beijing, Sanlu deliberately kept the crisis localized, reporting it only to municipal officials in the city of Shijiazhuang. This is because August 2008 was the month of the Beijing Olympics. The Games were designed to signal China's arrival as a modern global power, and a nationwide infant poisoning crisis would completely shatter that image. On August 2nd, just 24 hours after Sanlu confirmed the contamination, local officials in Shijiazhuang instructed Sanlu's board to suppress the test results, pay off the affected families, and keep the entire situation buried until the Olympics concluded. But Sanlu had a problem, because not everyone in their boardroom was Chinese. Sanlu was 43% owned by Fonterra, the massive New Zealand dairy cooperative. Fonterra had directors sitting on that Sanlu board, and they were getting the same horrible information as everyone else. And by early August 2008, they'd had enough. Fonterra couldn't force a recall on its own. They were a minority shareholder, but they could go over Sanlu's head, and so they did. Fonterra called the New Zealand government, and on September 8th, it convened an emergency meeting and ordered its senior officials and the New Zealand ambassador to Beijing to completely bypass the local Chinese government and blow the whistle directly to the central governments in Beijing. Less than a week later, the scandal went public. The official investigation revealed the massive scale of the contamination. According to Chinese government reports, by the end of 2008, nearly 300,000 children were affected, with over 52,000 infants requiring hospitalization. The probe eventually caught 22 different Chinese dairy brands selling melamine-spiked formula, proving the fraud had infected the entire domestic supply chain. For Chinese parents, this represented a total collapse of trust. They couldn't switch to a competing local brand because the competitors were implicated in the exact same poisoning. To guarantee their children's safety, families realized they had to bypass the domestic market entirely and look overseas. The closest, most tightly regulated dairy supply on the planet was sitting right here in Australia and New Zealand. This mass exodus of customers created the exact market conditions needed to rescue a small, struggling dairy operation called the A2 Milk Company. A2 was founded all the way back in 2000 by a New Zealand scientist called Dr. Corin McLaughlin and a dairy magnate named Howard Patterson. Their pitch was a bit unusual. They reckoned that the milk protein found in most Western cows, something called A1 beta-casein, might be causing health problems. They developed a genetic test that could pick out cows that only produced the other variant, called A2, and milk from those cows, they said, was easier on your stomach. Now, the science on this is genuinely still up for debate, and a big European review back in 2009 looked at all the evidence and couldn't find solid proof that A1 milk was actually harmful. Regardless, it was a strong premise and launchpad at the time, but the early days of the A2 company honestly were a mess. Both founders died within a month of each other in 2003, and the original business got liquidated that same year, owing money to farmers. It nearly didn't make it out of the starting blocks. But the company didn't die, and over the next decade, under new management, they slowly clawed their way back from the brink. They started small, focusing entirely on convincing local Aussie and Kiwi consumers to buy their fresh milk at the supermarket. By 2013, they'd stabilized the business enough to officially list on the New Zealand Stock Exchange, followed by a dual listing on the ASX in 2015. But up until this point, A2 primarily sold standard liquid milk. However, executives analyzed the market and recognized that millions of Chinese parents were still terrified of their domestic supply, actively searching for safe foreign alternatives. The company executed an aggressive pivot, and they dehydrated their tightly regulated milk, packaged it into tins, and launched an infant formula specifically designed for the Chinese market. Branded as A2 Platinum, the product was marketed as premium, foreign, and genetically safe. It directly capitalized on the massive consumer demand generated by the melamine scandal. And this is where our Daigou shoppers come back into the story, because A2 didn't sell directly into mainland China at first. The regulatory approval process for importing foreign infant formula into China is genuinely hard. You need specific brand registrations, importer licenses, and official distribution deals, and all that can take years to sort out. The Daigou channel allowed A2 to bypass Chinese import queues directly. They simply supplied the same Australian supermarkets they always had, while Daigou shoppers cleared the shelves, with the tins making their way into China via suitcases, parcel post, and the occasional naval vessel. At its peak, 70% of A2 Milk's entire revenue flowed through these personal shoppers. It was the core of their operation. And by 2020, the share price blew past $20, pushing the company's valuation to nearly $14 billion. Meanwhile, local Australian parents were left navigating empty supermarket aisles, experiencing the downstream retail fallout of a contamination crisis that had occurred in Hebei province a decade earlier. But when global borders locked down in early 2020, the Daigou network collapsed. The channel required international students and tourists to physically purchase stock inside Australian stores, and with commercial flights grounded, A2 Milk was suddenly trapped holding massive warehouse inventories with no functional mechanism to export them. Baby formula has a strict shelf life of about 2 years, and Chinese consumers are notoriously rigid regarding expiry dates. A tin that's 6 months away from expiration is considered unsellable. As the border closures dragged on, A2's stock aged out and lost its value. The situation escalated in 2022 when A2's primary Daigou partnership collapsed. They'd been working closely with a Chinese businessman named Wen Zhang, known in the industry as A2 Andy. When that relationship severed, the remains of A2's grey market distribution network went with it. The financial fallout was brutal. The share price, which had peaked over $20 in 2020, crashed below $4 by the end of 2023, an 80% wipeout. The company was forced to write off roughly $100 million in old, unsellable stock. An investor class action was launched over how the resulting earnings downgrades had been communicated to the market. In early 2021, David Bortolussi took over as CEO. He had previously run Pacific Brands, the Australian parent company of Bonds and Sheridan, giving him extensive experience in corporate turnarounds. He inherited a company dealing with a halving share price and a highly public dispute with departing CEO Jane Hudlicker. Bortolussi's strategy required A2 to completely sever its reliance on suitcase couriers and grey market arbitrage. The company needed to pivot to official, licensed distribution channels inside mainland China. Over the next 3 years, his executive team slashed the Daigou channel's share of the business from 70% down to less than 10%. They replaced it by partnering with China State Farm Agribusiness Holdings Shanghai, part of a Tier 1 Chinese state-owned enterprise. Securing a direct partnership with the Chinese state gave A2 the ultimate official legitimacy and regulatory protection. To support the new official channels, they doubled their marketing budget from $160 million to over $300 million, securing massive sponsorships like the Australian Open. They diversified their product line to target older children and seniors, expanded into Vietnam, and restructured their struggling US operations. Today, the share price has stabilized, and while it's not returned to that $20 peak, the restructuring successfully dragged the company out of its 2023 lows and firmly back into profitability. And this is all in spite of China's famously low birth rate. In 2017, the country recorded over 17 million newborns. Last year, that figure dropped to 7.9 million, marking the lowest national birth rate since records began in 1949. In the 6 months to December 2025, A2 recorded nearly $1 billion in revenue, an increase of almost 19% year on year. In their official market outlook, CEO David Boom informed investors that the company expects to achieve its $2 billion medium-term revenue target a full year ahead of schedule. A2's share of the Chinese infant formula market has doubled, growing from roughly 4% to over 8%, with executive targets aggressively set on reaching double digits. This paradoxical growth is driven entirely by the legacy of 2008. The infants being born today are the children of parents who lived through the melamine scandal. They remember the Sanlu cover-up and the hospitalized newborns, and because of this generational trauma, these parents are increasingly willing to pay premium prices for imported, heavily regulated safety. While the total volume of tins sold in China is shrinking, the price per tin is rising, allowing foreign brands to continually capture market share from domestic competitors. The Chinese government has spent 17 years and billions of yuan attempting to restore trust in its domestic dairy industry. Despite the effort though, millions of customers still prefer to buy milk powder produced by a New Zealand company sourced from Australian cows and delivered through a state-owned importer. Somewhere in regional Australia, a dairy farmer is currently milking a cow that was genetically tested for its beta-casein variant. That specific milk will end up on a shelf in Shanghai as a direct result of a poisoned batch of formula that left the Hebei province factory in the winter of 2007. A single contamination scandal on one side of the Pacific built, nearly destroyed, and ultimately rebuilt a $14 billion company on the other. So, what do you reckon? Did you ever find yourself standing in front of an empty baby aisle or noticing those weird 2-tin limit signs at Coles and wonder what on earth's actually going on? Maybe you know someone who made a bit of extra cash doing the Daigou runs themselves. Let us know in the comments section below. We read every single one and we genuinely love hearing from you. If you enjoyed this story, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss out on more deep dives like this. As always guys, thank you so much for watching and stay curious.